Hello and welcome to Dirty Christianity, the show where we investigate, explore, challenge, and get down and dirty with Christianity. My name is Alex, and you are about to be watching a very special episode that has been months in the making. When I first started this channel, one of the things that I really wanted to emphasize and prioritize was telling stories and perspectives that often get overlooked or just don't get the attention that they deserve. Enter the United States Institute of Peace. This nonprofit organization was founded by Congress with the explicit goal of fostering relationships and building lasting peace across conflict zones all across the world. This fantastic organization was unfortunately targeted, slandered, and shut down by the Trump administration and DOGE under Elon Musk in March of this year. Although there have been some legal battles going forth, it currently does remain shut down. So why bring this up? Why on Dirty Christianity are we talking about one of the many organizations that the Trump administration targeted and shut down? Well, if you think about it, what is one of the most popular names for our Lord and Savior? We call him the Prince of Peace. One of the most famous Beatitudes, blessed are the peacemakers. We talk all the time in Christian circles about the peace of God, peace being a foundational and important part of our Christian faith. And here you have the Institute of Peace, a part of the government that is focused entirely on building lasting relationships and lasting peace across the world. I can't imagine a more Christ-like thing to focus on. And so I reached out to a couple contacts I had at the Institute who were happy to speak with me about their side of the story, what the Institute was, and what we lose if it remains shut down. I would like to make one final point, though, before we begin the interview. Due to the climate of fear and targeted political retribution that the Trump administration has created during his time in office, my contacts, although eager to speak with me, were only able to safely do so under conditions of total anonymity. They are not whistleblowers, they are not leaking classified information, they are not saying or doing anything illegal. And yet, they are not able to safely speak with me openly and publicly. It has to be done anonymously. Thus, for the interviewers, I have some fantastic voiceover artists who were willing to give their time to help these stories come to life. And unfortunately, the voiceover artists that I brought in to help tell this story also only agreed to do so under conditions of anonymity. And so although everybody involved loved the idea and were eager to help make it a reality, that is where we are as a country right now. The level of fear and genuine concern for retaliation from this administration has made it that everybody involved in this is in fear for their professional and personal futures. But that is why it's even more important to tell it. So, without further ado, the first question I asked, simple. What is the Institute?
Well, the U.S. Institute of Peace is a national, nonpartisan, independent public institute that was founded by Congress and signed into law by President Ronald Reagan in 1984. Its mission is to prevent, mitigate, and resolve violent conflicts abroad. That's its mandate. We do so in several ways. We do trainings, we had peace games, so instead of war games, we do peace games, dialogue, high-level meetings around tables. We also engage directly in conflict zones by providing analysis, education, resources for those working for peace in those countries. We have a bipartisan board of directors, so we try to remain fair in that regard. We work on both sides of the aisle when it comes to policies. Just like there are institutes and academies to study war and how to win it, the concept of having an institute to study peace is actually something that was conceptualized as early as George Washington, who expressed a desire for this, but it didn't materialize until nearly 200 years later. It started with a grassroots movement in the 60s and 70s with veterans and members of Congress who were veterans who really wanted to have an institute that was dedicated to understanding how to prevent wars. And they understood truly what the cost of war was, right? The irreversible damage of war, monetarily, health-wise, in all sorts of ways. They actually saw war firsthand and saw their comrades fall in battle, and they know the cost of it. So in the 60s and 70s, the idea got traction, and then it really started going forward from there. It was signed into law by President Ronald Reagan in 1984, so we're funded primarily by Congress. Our beautiful building, that was the exception that was done by private donations, but just the building. So our funding primarily comes from Congress, although we do one-off projects with other organizations and agencies like the State Department, USAID, and they'll help fund projects with us.
So it's more of a partnership with these other organizations as opposed to, because I believe one of the criticisms that DOGE used to justify shutting it down was that, oh, well, all these organizations are doing the exact same work anyways. We don't need multiple organizations doing the same thing. But they weren't doing the same thing. It was a partnership with these other organizations on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, and we even had these partnerships with the Pentagon and others that were in Department of Defense. So we're not just about compassion and charity, which are important things, but we also have a very big security purpose as well for our country.
And that makes total sense, because you want there to be peace. You don't want all of these conflicts.
Right. You know that just preventing conflicts from happening through force, there's going to be pushed out animosity that lives in the hearts of people after these kinds of things. And to be able to have the soft power and understanding and knowledge of how to resolve those conflicts in ways that don't result in violence is in a way protection, security, ensures lasting peace.
And you said soft power, and I think that's something that the current administration doesn't really appreciate or understand, or many people in America don't really understand what that is. Because when they see power, they think military power, they think influence, the ability to say, hey, you are doing what I want you to do. So would you explain a little bit more what soft power is, like what that concept is?
I don't have a formal definition in front of me, but it's the ability to transform and influence relationships in a way that leads to positive outcomes without having to use force. I will caveat and say it's a fool's errand to just try and control the hearts and minds of everyone, because that's not possible. But we know that if you do something that harms someone else or causes a grievance, you're going to build resentment and distrust in them. And it always happens that distrust and resentment is going to lead to actions that go directly against peacefulness. Resentment and peace can't coexist. I mean, it's like that concept of what goes around comes around. Simple, but even so, I've heard some people argue you can't just put goodwill into the world and expect the exact same thing in return. And sure, sometimes it is still met with aggression or belligerent behavior. But I say it's even more certain that if you do treat others wrongfully, you're going to see unwanted outcomes. If not in the short term, then definitely in the long term. So it's better to still put forth good out into the world.
It's a lot of building relationships. I know USAID is another example of really using soft power and examples of going in to build a community and help with humanitarian resources. So what you're doing is building relationships there. And even though you're not putting the military right there, we're like, oh, wait, okay, we're doing this project together. We know we can trust you. And that helps the United States stay secure because it builds partnerships.
So it's partnerships it's building partnerships as opposed to dictating what happens. I think that's very important, especially talking about the Christ-like aspects of the U.S. government and the Christ-like mission of the Institute of Peace to build peace building. You don't do that with force. You don't invade somebody peacefully. You build partnerships with them and establish a firm, lasting relationship.
The other thing I didn't mention too is that our budget is typically very small compared to the entire defense budget in the United States. It's around $55 million average annually from Congress, and that's equivalent to a penny compared to Department of Defense's budget.
You know, foreign aid consists of only like 1% of the federal budget, which is very, very small. I think most people assume that foreign aid consists of a lot more.
I've heard of that actually, and I've seen some interviews with people asking like, what do you think the U.S. foreign aid budget should be? And they're like, I think 5 to 10% would be a good amount of foreign aid, but we're way higher than that, and they don't realize that a 5% foreign aid budget would literally change the entire world.
And that's what we do. We do a lot with a little money. All of our efforts are on a very small budget. And imagine if we had more, what we could do. But yeah, in a sense, we're a cost-efficient option and we do a lot with what we have.
Let's talk for a second about some of those projects. So we've talked about what the the Institute is in a general sense. What are some of the teams or the projects within the Institute? Like, what are some of the things that they do?
Well, we have thematic teams and we had regional teams. We had teams that focused on specific countries and areas across the globe. We also have field offices in places around the world. And then we also have thematic teams, which worked on things like specific topics, like peace processes.
Gender, religion. We had a governance team that worked closely with the State Department. We had a women peace and security team, youth peace and security team. We did a lot of good work.
We covered a lot of ground on all topics that could relate to what things might devolve into conflict and how do we study that. For instance, we worked with ongoing peace processes in Colombia and everything that came after the peace agreement that they had with their warring military groups. So the U.S. Institute of Peace directly worked with setting up, supporting their post-conflict judicial systems. And then we also trained Colombian officers on implementing and designing ceasefire mechanisms. And so those are peaceful processes, right? Those are things to promote peace.
And yeah, for some of the thematic team examples, the thematic teams often would work individually, but also at times would partner with our country teams. So some examples of that kind of collaboration within the Institute is that in Iraq, USIP actually facilitated interreligious reconciliation efforts among Sunnis and Shia after the US invaded Iraq in 2003, and led to the change to hold a high-level dialogue in 2007 that resulted in a declaration condemning religiously motivated sectarian violence. Then in Nigeria, the Institute worked to counter Boko Haram by forming Muslim and Christian partnerships to build trust among religious leaders in their communities. And we also do a lot of stuff here in the US by providing trainings and gatherings of U.S. religious leaders, U.S. policymakers, government officials, to equip them, with the skills that they need to support domestic and international conflict transformation and contribute to the overall goal of global peacemaking.
We did that work, and then we had, field offices, like I mentioned. We had a big field office in Afghanistan, and before everything collapsed, we helped shape U.S. and NATO stabilization efforts with research on traditional Afghan systems of justice. We worked on courses on conflict resolution at universities there. And so we worked with a lot of groups on working with the government and how to resolve disputes with different land pieces and people there. It's a very diverse place.
There is the Vietnam Wartime Accounting Initiative that the Institute had been working on.
It's a multi-year project to help with public education, government to government, and even people-to-people dialogue between Vietnamese and Americans. It's trying to address leftover legacies of the war, like Agent Orange, unexploded ordnance, and the recovery of wartime remains.
So those families can be at peace. Incredible work that team is doing.
Because it's just amazing that after a huge war like that and a lot of animosity that they could have towards the U.S. given everything, it didn't quite happen that way. And then we have this great relationship, and I think it's a lot of the willingness of the cooperation, the friendliness, but just there's a lot of that soft power at play. That kind of work is an important part of the wider work of building a strong partnership with other countries.
The Vietnam example that you just gave, that is an incredible example, because people don't even think about what happens after the war. And you think of the rebuilding, but not all of the families that have been torn apart, not just in America, but also in Vietnam. That's incredible.
Yeah, and I guess just kind of adding to the peace processes thing, our team, I don't think we were fully involved in Afghanistan at this point to be able to advise on this process. But after the U.S. had entered into Afghanistan, the Taliban had been defeated, and they reached out saying they wanted to be part of peace talks, an agreement, negotiate, figure out how they could be involved in this process. They were excluded from the get-go. And then later, back in 2002 and 2003, they said senior Taliban leadership sat down and said they wanted to have peace talks. It wasn't really a U.S. priority at that time anymore. Focus was shifting to Iraq, resources were shifting to Iraq, and so that was never something they got interested in. So they were shoved off to the side. And so you can't help but wonder, looking back, there were times later when we tried to reach out and they were non-compliant. So we feel like we kind of missed that window, and thinking about where we would be now without having spent 20 years and over $2 trillion in Afghanistan, and nothing's changed. It's gotten worse. So all of that money, all of that time, and the lives of American people, and the things that we're advocating for now, just like the example of the Colombian government, Colombian officials working to help bring in those who are part of the violent factions into those peace talks, that's important. And it's hard to measure peace. It's hard to measure how one might prevent war. It's hard to measure something that didn't happen, right? It's hard to prove a negative. But you look at this example in Afghanistan, you wonder if we could have included them earlier. Would we be seeing the things that we're seeing today? looking back at the steps, that if we could have applied a lot of the principles that we advocate for, what could have happened differently? And I push people to really think about that when it comes to our work and how this could be expanded.
If you look at Afghanistan where it is now, with people being given decades of stability and progress and experienced a life that they could have. I mean, I remember when we put out the Taliban basically retook the country in a matter of weeks, there were messages primarily from women, but from all aspects of society saying, I have to go out in the backyard and I have to bury my instruments now because I'm not allowed to use those anymore. And it's heartbreaking. And I think people underestimate the amount of work that goes into building a lasting peace. Just because the violence and the fighting is stopped doesn't mean that you have the infrastructure in place to keep that country stable and successful in the future. And so that was some of what y'all were doing, is going in and helping to establish lasting peace so that in 10 years' time, we don't have to go back into Afghanistan because it's gotten so bad that, international intervention is required.
We actually call that track 2 and track 3 diplomacy. So track 1 is typically where we're going to have the actual world leaders and the diplomats sitting at the table, drafting up the peace agreement and signing it. Those tracks below it are when you're actually working directly with the people who might be on the ground preventing, or I would say spoiling, the peace process because they were left out of the room, or they're the ones who actually have to live with their enemies day by day. And so we go in there and we try to help foster and heal and actually make sure those peace processes are effective, because we are there and actually carrying out what that peace agreement was, and kind of going into those communities that have been broken and have been hurt and finding ways for them to work together and rebuild their community together. And I think that's what's often forgotten about. Just because you sign something on a piece of paper doesn't make it happen. You got to have somebody who's there to help guide people day by day, help them learn how to live with their neighbors again after some atrocity has taken place.
Well, we're starting to have issues with that in America before the atrocities have taken place. Imagine trying to reconcile and rebuild after. We're already struggling with that in this country before it's even happened.
Yeah, I mean, we had government officials, high-level people on our side of the government, but also foreign government coming to us, for advice on how to handle things.
With everything that's happened, we still have had members of the Institute who are not employed, but are still being asked by the Department of Defense for advice because they are seen as experts in these fields. And so I think that speaks to the credibility of the Institute, also the credibility of our staff and the people that were there.
And so just to briefly summarize, just to make sure that I'm on the same page as y'all, the Institute has individual, independent contracts and work that you do with organizations within this country and around the world, but you also cooperate with various levels of the U.S. government to provide expertise and training. So it's kind of a multi-level, multi-solution peace-building program, kind of a one-stop shop for peace, which is something that we really should be prioritizing.
There are a lot of communities that they would rather work with us than the State Department, because we are not direct diplomats, but we still are close with the American government, and so we have that authority and legitimacy, but we also have the flexibility and the independence to be the voices and ears that these people need. I wanted to clarify that because it's been a question with a lot of stuff over the last couple of months with the Institute. We do not act as diplomats when we go in to do this work, which actually helps keep us trustworthy in a sense too.
Yeah, from my own personal experience growing up overseas, State Department's not always well liked, and having people coming in and saying, "Oh yeah, no, I want to help you. Yes, I am, technically with that, but I'm not with them." You can open so many doors that way.
Yeah, a lot of the independent contracting, that contracting that we do is working directly with those in those conflict zones that are helping us with these projects and programs. And then we feed that into these events and convenings, trainings that we have, and these dialogues and roundtables with high-level U.S. officials, like those in the Department of Defense, the State Department, and then foreign government as well, to be able to then feed into their decisions.
You mentioned working in conflict zones. So I know that one of the criticisms, or not even criticisms, one of the sources of one of the pieces of misinformation that was spread about the Institute was that you were working with people actively engaged in conflict, or you were funding terrorism, that sort of thing. But as a peace-building institute, you would kind of have to work with the people in conflict, would you not?
Yeah, I mean, you pretty much said it. Some of the criticisms we have gotten is certain people that we have worked with in the past and some rumors of where they came from. But we were working directly with the people who were respected in a lot of communities and who had specific networks and connections that the United States governments had been relying on for decades. Even outside of just the Institute of Peace, that other agencies and organizations were also aware of these people and working with these people. So we're not doing anything behind the US government's back or under the table.
And we've got all of that recorded of who we worked with and things like that. And they fed into our projects that directly helped the U.S. government uncover some terrible things that were happening in these places by other actors.
You mentioned earlier on that there is a paper trail for all of this, that there is like an auditing process, there's a reporting process. So there's not really any way that any of this stuff was done under the table, as you said. All of this stuff was recorded and cataloged for people with the proper authorization to review it. So none of this stuff was being done secretly or maliciously or anything like that. They always had the ability to go back and be like, hey, that's a little suspicious. Let me take a look at what you actually did. That was always an option on the table that they could have done.
They just needed to ask.
Does the Institute have any domestic peace-building initiatives?
So while our mandate is asking us to focus on preventing conflicts abroad, we did have that focus on educating the American public on what we do. But also there were resources like an academy that was online and free for anybody to access from anywhere in the world, including the U.S., to be able to have information on how to resolve conflicts, like peace processes, negotiation. And so these were things that could be used and provided for our American people. There were also programs for teachers here in the U.S., like a program that we had where they could use materials that we developed for classrooms for their middle school groups and their high school groups. And so they were doing projects about peace and what's negative peace and positive peace and implementing those. And that was really exciting to see as well happen here in the U.S. across all different states.
I also think of all the trainings that we do, even at the Institute with religious leaders in the U.S., it's not just diplomats who are getting ready to go abroad. But there are American citizens who are getting these trainings. I know that there are plans to work with military chaplains over at the Department of Defense, as well as to equip them for their work abroad. So even though our mandate is focused internationally, we still work closely with American citizens because they are our taxpayers. It's their institute too, so we treat it as such.
Right. And I also don't want to emphasize this too much because it's not really the point, but our work does help to keep from instability from happening in countries. And then therefore, if we're talking about not wanting worse situations, if we're talking about managing a immigration crisis or refugee crisis, and we don't want that to spill over and become overwhelming, this work helps prevent that from even happening in the first place.
What has the Institute either being shut down now, not being at full strength, being from an international level, America now being seen not as a stabilizing factor, but as an actively destabilizing factor? What are some of the things that have been lost with the Institute being targeted and shut down like this?
Well, I would say for our foreign counterparts, those that we worked with in other countries, their direct safety has been at risk. And I think it would prompt them to have second guesses or questions about working with the U.S. in the future. I think the fact that the headquarters staff was fired before the people in our abroad offices made it to where they couldn't contact anybody for safety reasons. Also, identifying information was put out for some of the people that we worked with that could be directly targeted and at risk. I think they would have second thoughts before wanting to work with us and to rebuild. That, again, is always much more difficult than it is to quickly tear something down, right? I think that's been a big loss.
I worry about the damage to our reputational lot, even as peace builders. Because if we do things like abandon our overseas partners at the drop of a hat, even though it wasn't our direct fault, That's not going to help the US. That is going to continue this narrative that we often see abroad, that the US is an untrustworthy partner, so we should never engage with them at all or even try to do peace work with them because they're just going to pull out again. And I think of all of the stuff that has been stopped because of the cuts across the board. When the US is not present anymore in those situations, guess who's moving into those situations? It's been China, it's been our adversaries. And so if you want to protect US interest, we're actually kind of harming them by no longer being present. What does our promise mean? What does our word even mean? And I also worry about, where are we? What happened to our American values and Christian values? What does loving my neighbor, as I see on your shirt, really look like? And that has been a big part of our American values. What does that look like when we just step back? It's like we lose a little part of ourselves. And I'm always reminded of Matthew 25. Whatever you do to the least of these, you do unto me. And if we're going to claim to be a Christian nation, or there are people here who want us to be a Christian nation, we should live by those Christian values and actually live them out.
Well, and from my perspective, I very much don't want this to be a Christian nation, because my question is always, what type of Christian? Because if you ask 5 different Christians what a Christian nation would be, you're going to get 5 different answers, and some of those are going to be very close to a dystopia. But from my perspective, as a voting, tax-paying U.S. citizen, I do want my government to do Christ-like things. If I've got to vote or if I have to support with my taxes the bad stuff that I don't like, you better have some of the good stuff that I do like. And so just from my perspective, even while saying that we have a secular government, or it should be a secular government, I want my government to do things that are a reflection of my faith. And it sounds like the Institute was a fantastic tool to do that.
Right. And the Institute was built up of people from all different backgrounds and expertise. And you can't just have one homogenous topic and one group to be able to address very, very different parts of the world, A lot of us there had those Christian values or were driven by those values, but the Institute worked as a convener and was able to also collaborate. We needed people who had connections with people in the Pentagon, people at the State Department, and you can't just do that if you're only familiar with one group. And so I think that was the beauty of USIP.
Yeah, it was one of my favorite things. We had a very interfaith community at the Institute. So we had people that were religious, different religions, some people who weren't. We kind of had a mix of everybody there, but just the type of conversations we would have, and that everything that we were doing came from a place of, we knew that's where God wanted us. This is what God wanted us to do. And we believed in the mission of the Institute. And even though we had differences, we believed in working with each other to achieve that common goal. That was something that was just beautiful, and that I loved coming into work every day to see my team and figure out what we could accomplish that day together. Seeing people from all different backgrounds, but all having the same goal of wanting to serve the meek and care for others and love each other.
The amount of thoughtfulness that was permeating the entire place. Working with people who would actually pray before doing their projects or pray throughout their projects and be like, sharing with their colleagues. I feel torn about this decision. I feel like I need to pray. Or just the amount of thoughtfulness put into it. You don't see that very often.
And that was normal. That was allowed to be. How can I help? What do I need to pray for? For that to not be an overtly Christian organization, but for it to just be people there of faith, and even those who are not of faith still, just this love and caring for each other. It was something that was very beautiful, and that I don't know if I could ever really fully experience anywhere else.
This isn't just a government organization. These are very profound people of faith who are using this as a way to act out their faith. In my previous video, I didn't go too deep into it, but I feel like I did a pretty good job of showing that it wasn't just the church's job to care for people, that the Bible, especially the prophets, pretty much make it very clear that the government does have a role in caring for people. And globally, from an international level, that still applies. And so the US government has resources that the church doesn't always have, and it has the ability to go into places and make connections with people that the church can't always do. And so to have people of very deep spiritual faith, giving them an ability to act out their faith from a way that both helps their country as well as people, as well as acting out their faith like that, I can't really see any negative to that.
We're an organization that is built up of people who are very passionate about loving our neighbor, about understanding how to prevent these conflicts from happening abroad, and also impacting us because we're in a world living together. We can't just remove ourselves from that. And so what happens somewhere else does have a trickle-down effect.
Well, and so that leads to, I guess, the elephant in the room. If it's literally a penny of the Department of Defense budget, and it is a very efficient use of that penny, you get a lot of work done with that penny. Do y'all have any thoughts about why? Were y'all just kind of the Institute, was it just kind of the low-hanging fruit?
I think we were seen as kind of a necessary win for them. They say we weren't complying with their orders to reduce our workforce, even though we had made cuts.
So DOGE took control of the building on March 17th. When that happened, we kind of lost access to all of our systems. So it was also really hard to communicate with anybody. And so while they were trying to get systems back online, and also we were going through all of the court system, because how we saw it is the firing of our president and then the appointment of this new president, Kenneth Jackson, our perspective was that it was done unlawfully. And so we were kind of also challenging this in court, but our leadership was like, okay, we should try to work with them the best we can. So as they were working to get systems back online, we were told to still be kind of on standby. Wait to be asked to come back to work, but everybody just stay at home for right now.
Well, so that does lead to a question. For the people who were furloughed or laid off, let go, funding dried up, what have you, y'all didn't receive any sort of resources or assistance or anything. It was just pretty much pack your stuff and get out, good luck.
This was the week of March 17th. A week later, on a late Friday night around 8 p.m., we start receiving termination letters. I did not receive any sort of severance. I didn't receive anything. It was, your termination is effective immediately. You'll get your annual leave paid out if you return all of your equipment. You're going to lose your health insurance at the end of the month. This was March 28th on a late Friday night, meaning people had one business day to figure out their health insurance. That put a lot of people in really dangerous situations, yeah. Those who need life-saving assistance, I was one of the lucky ones, but I know a lot of people were in a really desperate situation. Others who had been there longer, they were offered an actual severance, but only if they signed away their right to sue, which felt really dirty. During this time, I was doing my own little sort of self-reflecting and trying to figure out how could this happen. Like I say, I had it kind of easy. There were other people who were suffering a lot worse, and I had to watch my coworkers go through that and, turn to the Bible. What does this say? Was this allowed? How does this work? And the Bible doesn't say much directly about employees or employers in the modern sense of the words, but it does talk a lot about laborers and wages. And so if we apply that in today's world of employees and employers, everything that is done is supposed to be done with the well-being of the employee in mind. The employers are supposed to be fair to the employees. And so that was really kind of hard to take in because, like I said, it wasn't just me. The hardest was watching my coworkers go through it too. And we were already traumatized by the way our building was progressively broken into. And then for us to then receive on a late Friday night when people are just wanting to go to bed and enjoy their weekend, to then have to be panicking all weekend about What do you mean I'm going to lose my health insurance after Monday?
We're injuring our own people in a way that left many without insurance, given one day basically to have their health insurance. And just in the way that folks were fired and treated and handled in this situation, that's really harming ourselves, leaving those out to be jobless.
I have some Trump supporting friends. I have some people that I know for a fact voted for him. And they have said one of the things that they did not anticipate was the total lack of consideration for human dignity with these firings. And I think that's something that people don't often see. It's bureaucrats getting let go. No, these are people that have health needs, that have home and car payments, that have children that need food on their table. And it's one thing to say, hey, we think this has been done inappropriately. We think that this organization is no longer needed or valid. We're going to let you go. But, here's a month of extra work. We're going to give you some notice. We're going to help you with this transition period at a minimum. And that's not what happened. It was, the last working day of the month. Hey, you're going to lose everything in 12 hours. Good luck. That's not human. That's not treating humans with any sort of dignity or respect, especially not people who are very kind and loving people who are there specifically to try to help people.
And I have similar Trump-supporting friends and family who are horrified by the dismantling of USAID, because even if they thought there were some things that could be made more efficient, they still saw that work as Christian work. And we mentioned earlier that there was a grassroots movement that was a big part of helping the Institute of Peace be founded. It was veterans, but it was also a lot of faith communities, specifically Christian communities, especially the mainline Protestant groups like the United Church of Christ, the Quakers, the Mennonites, the Church of the Brethren. A lot of Catholic organizations were also involved. We had other faith groups, Reformed Jews come to mind. And I keep telling this story that a couple of weeks ago, I was actually at a Catholic prayer center. And the friar of the Catholic Church, he remembered when the Institute was founded. He saw that as a mission of the church, the Institute of Peace. And I know this is true for myself, my friend here. I know many of the organization felt like being at the Institute of Peace was God's calling for them. That is where God wanted them to be, and to be a peace builder. I mean, I think of one of the most famous verses in the Bible and the Beatitudes. Blessed are the peacemakers. And I feel like that's a direct calling of how we should be in the world. And the Institute of Peace itself was like living out that mission. When I look at the Bible and Jesus, I see the overall mission of it as being the reconciliation and redemption of relationships. And that means our relationship with God, our relationship with one another as well. I hear a lot of the argument also from my Trump-supporting friends and family, well, we don't need these foreign aid organizations because that's a role the church should be filling. And they don't know that a lot of those church projects were funded by organizations like USAID. But I also see that the Institute of Peace is a direct example of the mission of the church at work, especially given that a lot of the people that are working there are Christians or members of other faith groups, and that it was founded by Christians. I think that should be a part of the conversation of why we need it, why we defend it. It's a part of our Christian and American values, and always has been.